I still remember the exact moment I realized that everything I had worked for my entire life was gone. Not lost, not misplaced, but stolen. Taken by a man I had trusted more than my own brother. A man who had sat at my dinner table, who had comforted me at my wife's funeral, who had promised to protect my family's future with the same dedication he showed his own. That man was Jonathan Haldwell, and he was my financial advisor, my closest friend, and ultimately, the architect of the greatest betrayal I have ever known. But this story is not just about what he took from me. This is the story of how I took it all back. How I used his own rules, his own system, his own arrogance against him, and how I watched a $4 billion empire crumble, one carefully placed domino at a time. My name is Marcus Webb, and 23 years ago, I sold my software company to a Fortune 500 corporation for $47 million. It was the culmination of 2 decades of 18-hour days, missed family dinners, and the kind of obsessive focus that either makes you wealthy or destroys your health. In my case, it did both. But at 49, I had money I never dreamed possible, a beautiful wife named Sandra, and a son, Henry, who was just starting his junior year at Northwestern. Life, as they say, was good. I met Jonathan Haldwell at a charity gala in Chicago, the kind of event where men in perfectly tailored suits drink champagne and pretend to care about causes while really networking for their next deal. I was new to this world of extreme wealth, uncomfortable in my tuxedo, and completely out of my element. John spotted me immediately, like a shark sensing blood in the water, though I would not understand that metaphor until much later. He approached me with a warmth that felt genuine. He had done his research, knew about my company sale, complimented my work in enterprise software, and asked intelligent questions about the technology sector. Within 30 minutes, I felt like I had known him for years. That was John's gift. He could make anyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. Over the next several months, John and I became close. He invited me to golf outings, introduced me to his wife Victoria, and slowly, carefully, began discussing wealth management. He never pushed. That was part of his genius. He made me come to him. He would mention, almost casually, how he had helped a mutual acquaintance navigate a complex tax situation, or how his firm had generated consistent returns even during market downturns. He planted seeds and waited patiently for them to grow. Sandra adored John. She appreciated his refinement, his knowledge of art and wine, the way he treated Victoria with visible affection. She would often say that John was the kind of friend every successful person needed, someone who understood the unique pressures of wealth. She had no way of knowing that John was studying us, learning our vulnerabilities, and preparing to exploit them. After about 8 months of friendship, I finally asked John if he would consider managing my portfolio. He seemed almost reluctant at first, explaining that he was very selective about his clients, that he preferred to work with people he genuinely liked and respected. This, of course, made me want his services even more. Eventually, he agreed, but only if I promised to maintain our friendship regardless of our business relationship. I promised. I meant it. And I signed over $23 million to Haldwell Capital Management. For the first 3 years, everything was perfect. My quarterly statements showed consistent returns of 8 to 12%, even when the broader market struggled. John would call me personally to explain his strategy, using terms like risk-adjusted returns and diversified alternative investments. I understood enough to feel comfortable and not enough to recognize the fiction. Every number, every trade, every explanation was a carefully constructed lie. Meanwhile, our friendship deepened. When Sandra was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the fall of 2019, John was the first person I called. He came to the hospital, sat with me for hours, and held my hand when the doctors delivered the prognosis. 4 months, they said, maybe 6 with aggressive treatment. Sandra chose comfort over intervention, and John helped me understand that her choice was about love, not surrender. When she passed that February, John delivered the eulogy. He spoke beautifully about Sandra's grace, her devotion to our family, her quiet strength. He made me feel like my grief was understood, witnessed, protected. I will never forget what he said at the end. He said that Sandra had asked him during one of his hospital visits to promise that he would look after me and Henry. He said he had given her his word. The congregation wept. I wept. And I trusted Jonathan Haldwell even more completely than before. In the months that followed, I leaned on John heavily. I was not functioning well. Grief had hollowed me out, leaving me unable to focus on anything practical. John offered to take a more active role in managing my affairs, consolidating my accounts, simplifying my financial life so I could focus on healing. I agreed without hesitation. I gave him power of attorney. I gave him access to accounts Sandra and I had maintained separately. I gave him everything. By the time the first cracks began to appear, I had been a client of Haldwell Capital for nearly 6 years. It was Henry who noticed something wrong, though at first I dismissed his concerns as the paranoia of a young man who had read too many financial thrillers. Henry had graduated from Northwestern with a degree in data science and had started working for a cybersecurity firm in San Francisco. He was sharp, analytical, and increasingly suspicious of the documents John sent us. The quarterly statements are too clean, Henry told me during a video call in early 2022. The returns are too consistent. Markets do not work this way. I told him he was overreacting, that John was simply skilled at what he did. Henry did not argue, but I could see in his eyes that he was not convinced. A month later, Henry flew home for a weekend visit. He brought his laptop and a folder of printed documents. He sat me down at the kitchen table and showed me what he had found. He had been researching Haldwell Capital, digging through SEC filings, state business registrations, and publicly available information about John's firm. What he discovered was troubling. Haldwell Capital claimed to manage $4.3 billion for approximately 600 clients, but the auditing firm listed on their documents, a company called Sterling Whitmore Associates, did not appear to exist. There was no website, no office address, no listed phone number. The accountant whose signature appeared on every report was a man named Bernard Keene, and according to Henry's research, Bernard Keene had died in 2018. I felt something cold settle in my chest as Henry continued. He showed me how the returns John reported did not correlate with any known investment strategy. He had backtested the claimed trades against actual market data, and the numbers were impossible. Either John had discovered some form of financial alchemy, or the statements were fiction. For several minutes, I sat in silence, unable to speak. My mind raced through 6 years of trust, of friendship, of shared grief. I thought about Sandra asking John to look after us. I thought about John's hand on my shoulder at the funeral. I thought about the $23 million I had given him, money that represented my entire life's work. There must be an explanation, I finally said. John is my friend. He would not do this. Henry's response was gentle but firm. Dad, I know how much he means to you, but something is very wrong here. We need to verify that your money actually exists. The next week was the most agonizing of my life. I did not contact John directly. Instead, I requested a withdrawal of $500,000, citing an opportunity to invest in a real estate project. John responded within hours, expressing enthusiasm about the investment and promising to process the transfer immediately. The money arrived in my account 3 days later, and for a moment, I felt relief. Perhaps Henry was wrong. Perhaps the money was real. But Henry was not satisfied. He pointed out that a Ponzi scheme, which is what he now suspected, could easily produce $500,000 from new investor deposits. The true test would be requesting a much larger sum, something that would strain the operation. I could not do it. I could not bring myself to believe that John was capable of such monstrous deception. Instead, I chose a middle path. I asked John for a meeting. explaining that I wanted to discuss my overall financial strategy in light of my recent withdrawal. He agreed immediately, suggesting we meet at his downtown Chicago office the following week. I had visited John's office many times before. It occupied the top floor of a prestigious building overlooking Lake Michigan, with mahogany furniture, original artwork, and a staff of attractive young professionals who seemed perpetually busy. But this time, I saw it differently. I noticed how the young professionals never seemed to be doing anything specific. I noticed how the computer screens displayed generic financial dashboards rather than active trading platforms. I noticed how the artwork, which I had always assumed was genuine, bore subtle signs of high-quality reproduction. John greeted me with his usual warmth, embracing me like a brother and expressing concern about my well-being. He had heard I was struggling, he said. He wanted me to know he was there for me, just as he had promised Sandra. His sincerity was convincing. I almost abandoned my suspicions entirely. But then I asked him a question that Henry had prepared. I asked him to explain the specific trades that had generated my most recent quarterly returns. I used technical language that Henry had taught me, terminology that would require genuine knowledge to address. John's response was smooth but vague. He spoke about overall strategy and portfolio allocation without answering my actual question. When I pressed for specifics, he smiled and said that the details were too complex for a casual conversation, but that he would have his team prepare a detailed breakdown. That breakdown never arrived. When I followed up a week later, John apologized profusely, blaming a computer system migration for the delay. He promised the information within days. Days became weeks. Weeks became a month. And with each passing day, my dread grew deeper. It was during this waiting period that I received an unexpected phone call. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Claire Dawson, and she said words that changed everything. She said she was a former investigator with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and she wanted to talk to me about Jonathan Haldwell. Claire and I met at a coffee shop in a suburb far from the city. She was younger than I expected, perhaps late 30s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She explained that she had left the SEC 2 years earlier, frustrated by bureaucratic obstacles that prevented meaningful enforcement action. She had since become an independent consultant, helping victims of financial fraud navigate the recovery process. She had been tracking Haldwell for over 4 years, she told me. She believed his operation was one of the largest financial frauds in American history, potentially exceeding $4 billion. She had compiled substantial evidence, but lacked the one thing she needed to bring him down: a credible victim willing to cooperate with investigators and, if necessary, testify. I asked her why she had contacted me specifically. She explained that she maintained a network of sources, including people who worked within suspicious operations. One of her sources had flagged my account because of my recent withdrawal request and subsequent meeting with John. She knew I was starting to ask questions, and she wanted to reach me before John could silence those questions. I asked her what she meant by silence. Her answer was chilling. She told me about 3 former Haldwell clients who had voiced concerns over the past several years. One had died in a car accident that police ruled a tragic coincidence. One had suffered a complete mental breakdown after John threatened to expose fabricated evidence of tax evasion. One had simply disappeared, withdrawing his accusations and refusing to speak with investigators or journalists. John does not just steal money, Claire said. He destroys anyone who threatens his operation. He has connections everywhere, political, financial, social. Taking him down will not be easy or safe, but it is necessary. I should have walked away. I should have cut my losses, accepted that my money was gone, and moved on with what remained of my life. But I thought about Sandra. I thought about her asking John to look after us. I thought about how he had betrayed not just my trust, but her dying wish. And I felt something I had not felt in years. Anger. Pure, focused, burning anger. I told Claire I would help. And in that moment, sitting in that unremarkable coffee shop, we began planning the destruction of Jonathan Haldwell. Our first challenge was gathering evidence. Claire explained that the SEC and Department of Justice would need overwhelming documentation before moving against someone of John's stature and connections. His political donations had purchased protection at multiple levels. His social relationships included senators, judges, and media executives. Any accusation without ironclad proof would be dismissed and likely turned against us. I asked Claire what kind of evidence we needed. She outlined several categories: internal documents showing the fabrication of trades, testimony from Haldwell employees who participated in the fraud, financial records demonstrating the movement of client funds into personal accounts, and communication evidence such as emails or recordings that showed John's knowledge and intent. Gathering this evidence would require access to John's inner circle, something I did not have. But then I remembered something important. John's wife, Victoria, had always seemed different from her husband. While John was gregarious and dominant, Victoria was quiet and observant. She never participated in his business discussions, but she always seemed to be listening. And on several occasions, I had noticed tension between them, quick glances and tightened jaws that suggested their marriage was not as harmonious as it appeared. I shared this observation with Claire, who confirmed that Victoria might be a valuable ally. Her sources indicated that Victoria maintained separate financial accounts and had consulted with divorce attorneys on at least 2 occasions over the past decade. She stayed with John for reasons unknown, but her loyalty was clearly not absolute. Approaching Victoria would be delicate and dangerous. If she reported our approach to John, we would be exposed and neutralized before we could act. But if we could earn her trust, she might have access to information that would be impossible to obtain otherwise. I volunteered to make the approach. I had a legitimate reason to contact Victoria, my friendship with the couple, and I could frame the conversation as innocent concern. Claire agreed, but insisted that we prepare thoroughly. She spent several days coaching me on what to say and, more importantly, what not to say. I called Victoria on a Wednesday afternoon, knowing that John typically had extended lunch meetings on Wednesdays. She answered after 2 rings, sounding surprised but not unpleasant. I explained that I had been thinking about her since Sandra's passing, that Sandra had always valued Victoria's friendship, and that I wanted to invite her to lunch to catch up. Victoria hesitated, and for a moment I thought she would decline. But then she said yes, suggesting a restaurant far from their usual social circles. Her choice of location told me something important. She wanted to meet somewhere she would not be observed. Our lunch was awkward at first. I asked about her life, her interests, her plans. She answered politely but guardedly. I could sense that she was waiting for something, expecting me to reveal my true purpose. But I did not mention John directly. Instead, I talked about my own struggles, my grief over Sandra, my difficulty finding purpose in the years since her death. I made myself vulnerable, hoping that Victoria would reciprocate. She did, though it took nearly an hour. She began talking about her marriage, initially in vague terms, but gradually with more specificity. She spoke about John's long hours, his secretive phone calls, his recent irritability. She mentioned overhearing fragments of conversations that troubled her, discussions about moving money and managing problems. She said she had long suspected that John's success was built on something unstable, something that might one day collapse. I asked her directly if she was afraid. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine for something. Then she said yes. She was afraid. She had been afraid for years. But she was more afraid of what John would do if she tried to leave. Over the following weeks, Victoria and I met several more times. Each meeting brought new revelations. She told me about the safe in John's home office, the one he believed she did not know the combination to. She told me about the second phone he kept in his jacket pocket, the one he never used in her presence. She told me about late-night visits from men she did not recognize, men who arrived in expensive cars and left with briefcases. But the most important thing Victoria told me was about John's record-keeping. Despite the sophisticated facade of Haldwell Capital, John was fundamentally old-fashioned in his documentation. He kept physical records of everything, duplicates of every statement, every communication, every transaction. These records were stored in a climate-controlled vault beneath their house, accessible only through a biometric lock keyed to John's fingerprints. Claire and I realized that those records were the key to everything. If we could access them, we would have irrefutable evidence of the fraud. But breaking into a biometric vault was beyond our capabilities. We needed John to open it for us. This is where Henry's expertise became crucial. My son had been tracking our investigation from San Francisco, contributing research and technical analysis. When I explained the vault problem, he proposed a solution that was audacious and risky, but potentially effective. John's biometric system was a commercial product, Henry explained. Like many such systems, it had a maintenance mode that could be activated with a special code. This code was intended for technicians and was supposedly unique to each installation. But Henry had discovered through his cybersecurity contacts that the manufacturer had used predictable algorithms to generate these codes, algorithms that could be reverse-engineered if you knew the model number and installation date. Victoria confirmed the model number. The installation date was documented in home improvement records she found in John's desk. Henry spent 3 days running calculations before presenting us with 4 possible codes. We would have to enter them correctly on the first try. A failed attempt would trigger an alert to John's phone. We planned the operation for a Thursday evening when John would be attending a fundraising dinner downtown. Victoria would ensure that the household staff had the night off. Claire would wait nearby with a secure laptop to receive and copy any documents we found. Henry would monitor John's location through a tracking device we had placed in his car. I would enter the house, access the vault, and photograph as many documents as possible. The night arrived with agonizing slowness. I had not slept in days, my mind racing through every possible failure scenario. But when the moment came, a strange calm settled over me. I thought about Sandra, about her trust in John, about how he had violated her dying wish. I thought about the hundreds of other victims whose lives he had destroyed, and I walked into that house with complete clarity of purpose. Victoria met me at the door, her face pale but determined. She led me to John's office, a room I had visited many times but never examined closely. Behind a portrait of John's father was a concealed panel that opened to reveal the vault entrance. The biometric reader glowed red, waiting. But we were not here to fool the biometric system. That would be impossible. We were here to use the maintenance mode that Henry had identified. I entered the first of Henry's 4 codes, my fingers trembling against the keypad. Nothing happened. My heart hammered. I entered the second code. Still nothing. Victoria gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin. I entered the third code. The panel emitted a soft tone, and the vault door clicked open. Inside was a space larger than I expected, perhaps 10 feet by 15 feet, lined with filing cabinets and storage boxes. The air was cool and dry, preserved for document storage. I began photographing immediately, working methodically from left to right, capturing everything I could. The documents told a story of systematic deception spanning nearly 2 decades. There were fake trade confirmations, fabricated audit reports, and records of client funds being transferred to shell companies controlled by John. There were communications with the fictitious auditing firm, letters signed by the dead accountant Bernard Keene. There were personal notes in John's handwriting detailing how to handle suspicious clients, phrases like reassure and distract, and, if necessary, eliminate, with a notation that the last option should involve Martindale, a name I did not recognize. But the most damaging documents were in a red folder labeled simply Insurance. Inside were records of payments to various individuals, including a state senator, 2 SEC officials, a federal judge, and several journalists. These were not campaign contributions. They were explicit bribes, documented with meticulous precision, as if John anticipated one day needing to blackmail his own co-conspirators. I photographed everything in that folder, my hands shaking with the magnitude of what I was uncovering. This was not just fraud. This was corruption at the highest levels, a web of complicity that extended throughout the financial and political establishment. I had been in the vault for 47 minutes when my phone buzzed. It was Henry. John had left the fundraiser early. He was heading home. I had perhaps 15 minutes before he arrived. I grabbed the remaining documents I could reach, photographing frantically. Victoria appeared at the vault door, her face white with terror. "We have to go," she whispered. "Now." I made a decision that would prove crucial. I did not simply close the vault and leave. Instead, I took one document, a single sheet of paper that summarized the overall fraud in John's own handwriting. It was a memo to himself, a kind of status report dated 3 months earlier. It stated the total amount of client funds under management, the actual funds remaining, and the shortfall. The numbers were staggering. Of the $4.3 billion clients believed they had invested, only $214 million remained. The rest had been spent, stolen, or paid out to earlier investors in the classic Ponzi pattern. I took that document because I knew that one day I would want John to see it. I would want him to know that his own meticulous record-keeping had destroyed him. Victoria and I left through the back entrance moments before John's car pulled into the driveway. I drove to Claire's location, my hands still trembling, and uploaded all the photographs to her secure server. By midnight, we had cataloged over 4,000 pages of documentation, enough evidence to send John to prison for multiple lifetimes. But we did not go to the authorities immediately. Claire explained that the corruption we had uncovered meant we could not trust normal channels. The SEC officials on John's payroll would bury any complaint. The federal judge would quash any warrant. We needed to approach this differently, using John's own rules against him. John's entire operation depended on trust. His clients trusted him to manage their money honestly. His co-conspirators trusted him to keep their involvement secret. His victims trusted that nothing could be done. We would systematically destroy each of these trust relationships, creating cascading failures that John could not contain. We began with the clients. Claire had maintained a list of approximately 60 Haldwell Capital investors she had identified through various means. We sent each of them an anonymous package containing a summary of the fraud evidence, a guide to verifying their account holdings, and instructions for contacting law enforcement. We timed the mailings to arrive on the same day, giving John no opportunity to control the narrative. The effect was immediate and explosive. Within 48 hours, John was fielding dozens of calls from panicked clients. Some demanded immediate withdrawals. Others threatened legal action. A few, those who had been with John longest and trusted him most completely, defended him angrily. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it would grow inexorably. John responded with characteristic manipulation. He held a conference call for all clients, expressing outrage at the anonymous attacks and claiming they were the work of business rivals seeking to damage his reputation. He provided what appeared to be independent verification of his firm's stability, including a statement from an auditing firm that, unlike the fictitious Sterling Whitmore Associates, actually existed. The statement was, of course, falsified, but most clients did not know enough to question it. Our next move targeted John's co-conspirators. We sent a different package to each of the individuals documented in the insurance folder, containing copies of their own bribery records, along with a simple message. John Haldwell is under investigation. He will be arrested within 90 days. Everything he has documented will become public record. Consider your options. We did not ask for anything. We did not threaten. We simply provided information and let human nature take its course. Within weeks, the consequences began to emerge. The state senator announced his retirement from politics, citing family reasons. One of the SEC officials abruptly resigned and moved to Argentina. The federal judge recused himself from all financial cases, claiming a previously undisclosed conflict of interest. John noticed these departures. He was not stupid. He understood that something was hunting him, picking off his protections one by one. But he did not know who or why. His phone calls became more frequent and more aggressive. His social appearances became less common. Victoria reported that he had begun sleeping with a pistol under his pillow. Our third move targeted John's reputation. We provided the journalists on his payroll with a choice. We had evidence of their corruption, and we would release it unless they published accurate stories about Haldwell Capital. Most refused, but two agreed, perhaps calculating that getting ahead of the story was better than being destroyed by it. Their articles, published in respected financial outlets, described serious questions about Haldwell's practices and called for regulatory investigation. John responded with fury, threatening legal action against the publications and demanding retractions. But the stories had cited anonymous sources and presented questions rather than accusations. There was nothing defamatory to retract, and every denial John issued only drew more attention to the questions. The cascading collapse accelerated through the spring of 2023. Client withdrawals exceeded John's ability to pay, forcing him to delay transfers with increasingly implausible excuses. Former employees, sensing the approaching disaster, began quietly approaching regulators to negotiate immunity in exchange for testimony. Victoria, who had been gathering her own escape plan, secured copies of documents that even I had not photographed during my vault visit. But John was not finished. As his empire crumbled, he became increasingly desperate and dangerous. He hired private investigators to identify the source of the anonymous packages. He increased security at his home and office. He began carrying a weapon openly, and he made a decision that would ultimately seal his fate. He decided to run. I learned of his plan through Victoria, who had discovered flight reservations and bank transfer records suggesting John intended to flee to a non-extradition country. He had liquidated the remaining $200 million in client funds and converted them to cryptocurrency stored in anonymous wallets. He planned to disappear within the month, leaving behind hundreds of ruined victims and a defunct corporation. I could not allow this to happen. Not just for the other victims, but for Sandra. John had looked into my eyes, had held my hand at my wife's funeral, and had promised to protect my family. He had used my grief to steal my life's work. He had used my trust as a weapon against me. He had to face consequences, real consequences, the kind that would follow him forever. Claire and I made a decision. We would force John's hand before he could flee. We would give him no choice but to confront what he had done. I called John directly, something I had not done in months. My number was probably flagged in his phone, marked as a potential threat. But he answered anyway, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of arrogance. "John," I said, keeping my voice steady, "we need to talk. In person. It is about Victoria." There was a long pause. Then John spoke, his voice controlled but wary. "What about Victoria?" "She came to me," I said. "She is afraid. She wants out. But she knows things, John. Things that could hurt you. I think I can convince her to stay quiet, but I need to understand what I am dealing with. I need you to be honest with me." Another pause. I could almost hear John calculating, weighing risks and benefits. Finally, he agreed to meet me the following evening at his office. He probably intended to assess how much I knew and, if necessary, neutralize me as he had neutralized others. But I had a different plan. I arrived at John's office at 7 in the evening, as agreed. The building was largely empty, most employees having gone home. John met me in the lobby and led me to his private office, the same room where I had once trusted him with my life savings. The same room where I had dismissed my son's concerns and chosen friendship over suspicion. John offered me a drink, which I declined. He poured one for himself, a generous measure of whiskey, and settled into his chair. He looked tired, I noticed. The stress of the past months had aged him. His famous charm seemed dimmed, replaced by something harder and more brittle. "Marcus," he said, "I have to admit I was surprised by your call. I heard you had some concerns about the firm. I assumed our friendship was strained." I looked at him steadily. "Our friendship ended when you stole everything I had." John's expression flickered, the first crack in his composure. "I do not know what you have heard," he said, "but I assure you." I pulled out my phone and placed it on his desk. On the screen was a photograph of the memo I had taken from his vault, the summary of the fraud in his own handwriting. John stared at the image for a long moment. His face went through several transformations, shock, then fury, then a strange calm that was more frightening than anger. "How did you get this?" he asked quietly. "It does not matter how," I replied. "What matters is what happens next. You have two choices, John. You can run, like you are planning. Take your cryptocurrency and disappear to some country without extradition. Spend the rest of your life hiding, looking over your shoulder, wondering when the past will catch up. And the second choice? You turn yourself in. You face what you have done. You give federal prosecutors everything they need to recover whatever funds can be recovered. You help make your victims as whole as possible, and you accept the consequences." John laughed, a bitter sound without humor. "Why would I possibly choose that? A life in hiding is still a life. Prison is a cage. I am not going to spend my final years in a cell because you feel betrayed." I leaned forward. "Because if you run, I will follow. I have spent the last year learning exactly how you operate, John. Your methods, your contacts, your patterns. Claire Dawson and I have built a network that spans 3 continents. Wherever you go, we will find you. And we will not just expose you to the authorities. We will expose you to everyone you have ever bribed, threatened, or betrayed. We will make sure they know exactly how much evidence you have kept against them. You will not just be a fugitive from justice. You will be a target for everyone whose secrets you hold." John's composure cracked further. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his whiskey. "You are bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I am not." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. "I have nothing left to lose, John. You took my money. My wife is gone. My son is safe and beyond your reach. Everything I had, you destroyed. The only thing I have left is the truth. And I will spend every remaining day of my life making sure that truth follows you wherever you go." The silence stretched between us. I could feel John weighing his options, calculating odds as he always did. But for once, the math was not in his favor. Finally, he spoke. "If I turn myself in, what happens to Victoria?" I turned to face him. "Victoria has been cooperating with us for months. She will testify against you in exchange for immunity. But she will also tell the truth, which is that she was a victim as much as anyone. You controlled her through fear and manipulation. The prosecutors understand that." John closed his eyes. I could see something shifting in him, the final collapse of whatever delusions had sustained him. When he opened his eyes again, they were empty. "You have planned this thoroughly," he said. "I learned from the best." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I need time," he said. "A few days to get my affairs in order, to speak with an attorney." I shook my head. "No. Tonight. Claire has already notified the FBI. They are waiting downstairs. You can walk out of this building with some dignity, or you can be dragged out in handcuffs. Either way, it ends now." John's face contorted with sudden rage. He lunged for his desk drawer, where I knew he kept a pistol. But I was faster. I grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back, using techniques I had learned in the military decades ago, skills I never thought I would need again. "It is over," I said into his ear as he struggled. "You cannot hurt anyone else. It is finished." The door burst open, and FBI agents flooded the room. John was handcuffed and read his rights while I stood by the window, watching it all unfold. Claire appeared at my side, her face showing relief and exhaustion in equal measure. "You did it," she said. "We did it," I corrected her. "All of us." John was led out of the building past a crowd of reporters who had been tipped off about the arrest. The images of him in handcuffs, his expensive suit rumpled and his famous composure shattered, would dominate financial news for weeks. The unraveling had begun. The investigation that followed was the largest securities fraud case in American history. Federal prosecutors ultimately charged John with over 200 counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and bribery. The evidence from his vault, combined with testimony from cooperating witnesses including Victoria and several former employees, left no room for reasonable doubt. The trial lasted 4 months. I testified for 2 days, recounting my relationship with John, the gradual discovery of his deception, and the emotional impact of his betrayal. I spoke about Sandra, about the promise John had made at her deathbed, about how he had used my grief as a weapon. The jury watched footage of John at her funeral, delivering his beautiful eulogy, and then saw documents proving he had been planning to steal our money, even as he spoke those words. John was convicted on all counts. The judge, one of the few in the jurisdiction not compromised by John's bribes, sentenced him to 150 years in federal prison. He would die behind bars, just as so many of his victims had died in poverty and despair. But the consequences extended far beyond John himself. The corruption he had documented in his insurance folder became public record, triggering a cascade of resignations, prosecutions, and reforms. The state senator went to prison for accepting bribes. 2 SEC officials were convicted of dereliction of duty. The federal judge who had been on John's payroll was impeached and removed. Several journalists lost their careers when their corruption was exposed. The recovery of stolen funds was slower and more difficult. Of the $4.3 billion John had taken from his clients, only about $700 million was ultimately recovered through asset seizures and the liquidation of his property. This represented less than 20% of what had been stolen, a painful reality for many victims who would never recover their losses. I was among the fortunate ones. My original investment of $23 million was largely recovered through insurance and seizures, though it took nearly 2 years to finalize. More importantly, I had something that many victims lacked: closure. I had faced my betrayer, confronted him with the truth, and watched him face consequences. I had honored Sandra's memory by refusing to let her trust be exploited without response. Henry returned to Chicago after the trial, taking a position with a financial crimes investigation unit. He said the experience had given him a new sense of purpose, a desire to protect others from predators like John. Claire continued her work as an independent investigator, using the Haldwell case as proof of what was possible when victims refused to stay silent. Victoria divorced John while he awaited trial and eventually testified against him in exchange for immunity and witness protection. She reached out to me once, about a year after John's conviction, to thank me for giving her the courage to escape. She said she had been trapped for so long that she had forgotten escape was possible. I told her that I understood, that John's manipulation had trapped us all in different ways. We wished each other well and parted as unlikely allies who had survived a common enemy. I think often about the nature of trust and betrayal. John was not born a monster. Somewhere along the way, he made choices that hardened him, that convinced him other people existed only as resources to be exploited. He cultivated relationships the way a farmer cultivates crops, nurturing them until harvest time, then cutting them down without remorse. His charm, his intelligence, his social grace were all weapons in a long campaign of predation. But his downfall came from the same qualities that enabled his success. His meticulous record-keeping, designed to protect him through blackmail, became the evidence that destroyed him. His cultivation of relationships created the network of witnesses who testified against him. His arrogance, his belief that he was smarter than everyone around him, blinded him to the danger until it was too late. There is a lesson in this, I think. Those who manipulate others for personal gain inevitably create enemies. They may succeed for a time, sometimes for a very long time, but every lie told is a debt that must eventually be paid. Every trust betrayed is a potential witness for the prosecution. Every victim silenced is a voice that may one day speak. John used his own rules against himself. He taught me, through years of friendship and fraud, exactly how he operated. He showed me the importance of documentation, of patience, of exploiting relationships for strategic advantage. And when the time came, I applied those lessons with the same methodical precision he had used against me. I do not take pleasure in John's destruction. There is no joy in watching another human being lose everything, even when that human being deserves it. But there is satisfaction in justice, in consequences, in the knowledge that at least one predator has been stopped. There is peace in knowing that Sandra's memory is no longer stained by association with a fraud. There is gratitude for Henry, for Claire, for Victoria, for everyone who helped bring truth to light. Last month marked 3 years since John's conviction. I visited Sandra's grave, as I do every few weeks, and told her what happened. I like to think she would be proud, not of revenge itself, but of the refusal to accept injustice passively. She always said I was too trusting, too willing to see the best in people. She was right. But she also taught me that trust, once broken, demands response. John writes to me sometimes from prison. The letters are long and self-justifying, filled with explanations and rationalizations. He claims he never meant to hurt anyone, that he was trapped by circumstances, that he made mistakes under pressure. He asks for my forgiveness. I read the letters. I do not respond. But I keep them, carefully filed, as evidence that even now, facing the consequences of his actions, John cannot accept responsibility. He still sees himself as a victim, still believes his own manipulations. Some people never change. They simply find new ways to lie, even when the lies serve no purpose. I am 62 years old now. I have more money than I will ever need, health that is reasonably good for my age, and a son who makes me proud every day. I have work that matters, consulting with organizations that help fraud victims navigate recovery. I have friends who know my story and still choose to trust me. I have a life that, despite everything, feels meaningful. And I have this story, which I share not for sympathy or admiration, but as a warning and a hope. A warning that predators exist even among those we love most, and that trust must be verified as well as given. A hope that when betrayal strikes, when everything seems lost, there is always a path forward for those willing to take it. John thought he was too smart to be caught, too connected to be prosecuted, too powerful to face consequences. He was wrong about all of it. He forgot the most important rule of his own game. When you make enemies of the people who trusted you most, you create adversaries who have nothing left to lose and everything to gain from your destruction. I was that adversary. I am that adversary still. And though the battle is won, the lessons remain. Trust carefully. Verify constantly. And when someone betrays the sacred bond of close relationship, when they use your love and grief and vulnerability as weapons against you, do not despair. Do not surrender. Instead, learn their rules. Study their methods. Build your evidence. Find your allies. And when the time is right, use everything they taught you to ensure they face the consequences they deserve. This is how empires built on lies collapse. This is how justice finds its way even through the darkest corruption. This is how ordinary people, armed with nothing but truth and determination, can bring down giants. John Haldwell ruled a $4 billion kingdom of fraud for nearly 20 years. It took me 2 years to destroy him completely. He never saw it coming, and that, in the end, was the most satisfying revenge of all.